I decide to share my entire screen. Okay, I think we're ready now. All right. So again, when we're talking about middle childhood, what we're really talking about is about the age of 6 years old through the puberty years. So it takes us from those early childhood years into the puberty, more physical adult periods of life. And what separates middle childhood apart, and I've also termed this late childhood, but middle childhood apart from early childhood is really the type of socializations and the things that we're doing. So in early childhood, most of our socialization is with the immediate family, parents, maybe child care providers, but even in the child care providing setting, the number of children the child actually interacts with is still limited, okay, and more predictable. Plus, we need to remember that our brain, develops about 90% outside the womb, and that's happening between birth to 6 years of age. So our brain has a lot more capacity when we enter that 6-year-old range. So we start to see more fine motor skills, learning, the ability to learn new concepts and more complex concepts start to emerge. So that's really why we separate the two ages. Okay. Now there has been some argument, that early childhood should go from 0 to 8 years of age. And then middle to late should go from 8 to puberty. But for the sake of us, we're going to go with these kind of age ranges. Okay. So some of the growth changes that we look at during middle childhood, and one of the other reasons we separate this as a unique period of time, is our body prepares for puberty towards the end of middle childhood, okay? And one of the things that we'll see on this next chart, and is important to keep in mind, puberty is not something that is just an immediate process that, within a month or so, all of a sudden we go from childhood body to an adult body. It's actually a couple years long, as we'll see in this next chart that I'm going to show next. Okay, but in order to prepare for puberty, what we start to gain is some of the secondary sex characteristics that are associated with girls and boys. Really up to about the age of 8, it starts around the age of six. Children are really what we would call androgynous, okay? Meaning that if we didn't socialize our children into boys and girls, if we dressed our children the same, really from a physical perspective, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a girl and a boy, okay? In that they would all have the same bodies and the same features. But around the age of 6, and especially around the age of 8, we start to get the differentiation and being able to tell the difference between who are physiologically boys and who are physiological girls, okay? We do know that girls start out faster and they typically grow much quicker, but boys are going to catch up, especially during those puberty years. This is also when we get a lot of physical complaints about growing pains. And they are truly pains from the body growing very rapidly, as this next point brings up. In early childhood, if you remember those graphs we showed, the torso was longer than the legs and the upper body, okay? And what's unique again about this period is instead of the torso growing from that center out, remember that's how we grow from infancy on. Now we're going to start getting rapid growth rapidly in especially the legs and the upper body. And this is where we start to get more of our upper body strengths, and our legs tend to be more grow more rapidly as well. And fine motor skills start to develop quickly during this period. Remember, growth is aimed towards the extremities. And so we start getting more fine-tuned abilities with our fingers and our hands. Okay. Now, as I said, puberty actually is quite a lengthy period. If you see in this chart, it starts around the age of 8. And it peaks at around the age of 11 to 14. This is when a lot of times, for example, females will get their first menstruational cycle and those types of things. But it typically doesn't end until about after the age of 16. And we see with boys, their puberty starts at around 10 and a half and is going to end at around the age of 18. Okay. And so with girls, what we're going to see first is what's called breast budding and growth of pubic hair. And we're going to see a huge growth spurt from about 9.5 to about 14.5. And this is where many young girls go through a lot of growth and a lot of body issues that we start to see as adolescence is known for things such as eating disorders and body dysmorphia, as you would say. And as you will see, the first menstruation, which is what commonly people think marks the onset of physical going from a child to adult. First period or menstruation for women happen around 10 to about the age of 16. Now, I remember at the beginning of now what is significant about that first menstruation is that is when the female theoretically and physiologically is ready for impregnation. So after that, the eggs are being released, and so they can be fertilized at that point. And I think at the beginning of the course, we've talked about how this is changing over time. I mentioned that we're seeing girls as young as 4 and 5 going through puberty. And we know that this is a genetic, biological, environmental interaction, because we see, for example, young girls in urban areas go through puberty at younger ages than girls in rural areas. We see parents have an influence. So an emotionally distant mother or an absent father is associated with earlier onset of the first menstruation. So the point I want to make at this point is, again, we have to look at how family dynamics go into these types of happenings, okay? We start to see, again, some of the other secondary sex characteristics, such as under armpit, change in body shape. And then we see it at around after 12 and a half coming to the adult breast side from the budding size. Okay. With young men, we see the growth in the scrotum and testes starting at around the age of 10 and a half. And again, lasting to about the age of 17. We see voice changes because with the growth of the scrotum and the testes, you also start to get a production of sperm, and the sperm production process starts. This increases exponentially the amount of testosterone that the young boy or young man or adolescent is producing. And so this creates changes in voice levels that can go from higher pitch and then down to lower pitch sounds. We see the lengthening of the penis during this time. growth of the pubic hair. And so when we look at, and then we see a growth spurt from about the age of 12 to 17. And if you look at the growth spurt for young girls, you notice that it goes from about 9.5 to about 14.5. And then for young boys, it goes up to 17 and starting at 12. So that's what was meant by that previous slide, that women tend to go through their growth spurts at a younger period than young boys. We see changes in body shapes. Again, we're getting more upper arm, and our legs are growing at a much faster rate. And we start to get those other secondary sex characteristics, which include growth of facial and underarm hair. Okay. Now, just like girls, when they go through their first menstruation period, what's going to happen during this period, and it usually is associated with the lengthening of the penis and the growth of the scrotum, it kind of takes both of these into account, is when the ejaculate that a young boy starts to emit includes large amounts of sperm. And so we see that during this period is when a young boy going physically to a man has more susceptibility to impregnating a young lady. And at the same time, young ladies are going through a period where they'll start to menstruate and be able to have that egg impregnated. Okay. And so those are the things that are happening. And I just want to know, when we look at this, the time periods for these, and it's an important point to make. For young women, we usually start at age of 8 and usually doesn't end until about 16.5. And for young boys, it usually starts at around 10.5 and doesn't end until 18. Now, by the age of about 21, 22, when we talk about growth rates, even things like neural growth rates, advantages between boys and girls start to wash out, meaning they become null. Okay, so any advantages we see through earlier onset of cognitive abilities, emotional abilities, tend to equalize based on gender at around the age of about 21, 22 years of age. Okay. When we talk about physical growth, the peak for young girls is around 10.5, and for boys, it's around 14.5. This is where our growth will be at its highest rate. And then after that, it will start to slow. Now, that doesn't mean we stop to develop. We will continue to get a little taller and higher through the years, but the rate of growth is slowing. Okay. And as we will see when we get to middle adulthood and late adulthood, our growth really doesn't continue, because we actually start to lose mass and lose height in about middle adulthood. So something to look forward to. You might need to help with cupboards or something. No, I'm just kidding. Myelination. Myelination, again, is that those fatty pieces that lay over the axon of a cell, and it has two purposes. One, it protects the cells. The second thing is it speeds up speeds up the electrical impulse in the person's brain. Okay. And one of the things that we should note, and this was a kind of a recent discovery, is that we actually think that this has a lot to do with why some teenagers, some adolescents go through a difficult adolescence and others don't, less based on the hormonal theory. Hormonal theory stating that, some adolescents have difficulty because their hormone levels are out of control. And while there is some things that I think can be stated about that, it doesn't explain everything. And most recently, we found that during the puberty years, and if I go back to here, during this period, kind of when we have this fast growth spurt, and during this peak period of time, there is about a 6-month period of time where our brain goes from about 10% myelinated to about 85, 90% myelinated. Okay. And what does this mean? Really, it really means that within about a 6-month period of time, our brain goes from going at 25 miles an hour to 250 miles per hour, meaning there's just this rapid increase in the transmission of neural information going on. And the current theory of why that is because in early childhood and middle childhood, it's important to have a slower brain that because it learns better when it's not rapidly going through information. But to survive as adults, we need more of a fast brain. Okay. So, as an adult, let's imagine there's a car going at your child who's 5 years old. You don't want to sit there and contemplate whether you should move the child or not. You just want your body to react and get the child out of the way, because that child's going to sit there and wonder what it should do, and slowly, with their slower brain, be less likely to get out of the way. Okay. So that's one thing that we've learned over the recent decades about adolescent brains, is they tend to rapidly go much quicker. Okay. We also see continued growth in very important regions of the brain. Okay. The first one is the frontal lobes. So this is the area just behind our eyeballs and our forehead. And this is the area that gives way to things like abstract thinking, to problem solving, those types of things. And it is actually the last part of the brain that develops. Okay. It does things like impulse control, all those. And it's theorized that the frontal lobe doesn't stop growing until around the age of 27 or so. The parietal lobe is an area that integrates information. So this is when individuals are able to process multiple pieces of information and see how things are connected. The corpus callosum is what connects our two lobes of our two hemispheres. And then we start to see many more connections related to things like long-term memory. Okay. And this is where we start to be able to form long-term memories. And this is kind of why we think people in their older years remember more about their high school years than they do their first and second grade years, for example, because right around the high school years is when these connections are strengthened in the long-term memory system, that those memories are held stronger than ones in our junior years and our elementary years. So it is also during this period when we need to start looking at things like mental disorders, especially. So in early childhood, there's many you can't divide, mental disorders, because children in early childhood can develop depression, anxiety. They can, we know the autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and all those kinds of things. But it is really during middle childhood and into adolescence where we start to see mental disorders disrupting the individual's ability to socialize, the ability to develop into the world. And so I just want to spend just a couple minutes talking about different views about mental disorders. Okay. We have traditional views, and when we look at traditional views, we can see, for example, the Greeks said the problem body and favor disfavor of God. And so we get what's called the moral aspect of mental disorders, where people who have disordered behavior is because they have weak, more moral constitution. So they're more likely to, for example, be possessed by evil spirits in the case of things like psychosis. And they have less ability because it's a moral issue. Okay. And this can be found in other cultures. In many cultures, we have, even here in the Americas, the notion of demonology, and this demonology being that, again, person with disordered behavior, disordered minds, tend to be possessed by or persuaded by some type of evil force. Okay. This kind of view led to things like the famous witch trials that we see in Salem, and this idea that especially women and old, feeble individuals are more susceptible to mental illness. And that view has even still has some cultural implications for today, where women tend to be seen as more, and don't, this is not a true scientifically found thing, but it is definitely a culturally found thing, that women are much more susceptible to mental illness than men. And this can be seen in the work of Sigmund Freud, where he even institutionalization up into the 1960s, where when Freud started his talking cure, which then led into therapy and counseling, he very much felt like mental illness was a female disorder. That it wasn't something men often succumb to. And we'll even see well up into the 1950s and 60s, women needing their husband or their father's permission to get treatment, because who knew better than the father or the husband. Okay. And then around the 1950s, we have something called the chemical revolution. When this is where, especially here in the United States, there was even billboards that said better living through chemistry. Okay. This is where we get the development of antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, anti-psychosis medications. And so we start to see mental illness from a more biological standpoint rather than a moral or individual standpoint. Okay. And then we get into, and I'm going to skip here to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of today. This is a DSM, and we're in the DSM-5, where we're seeing which lists criteria for different mental disorders based on symptomology. So in today's modern mental disorder view, we look at symptomology and alleviation of those symptoms. Okay. Now this is different from what's called with a growing view that is called the developmental view of psychopathology. Okay. In the developmental approach, it states that just like an organic disorder, such as type 2 diabetes, as an example, those physical disorders that we're not necessarily born with, even certain types of cancers and those types of things, they occur over a developmental period. Okay. Meaning that it's our interaction in life that develop into those disorders. And as we know, when we look at risk reduction for diabetes, we should be doing diet and exercise, all of those kinds of things. While in the evolution of mental disorders, there's starting to be this same type of evolution, where it's being seen as a disorder is due to dysfunction within the individual's developmental trajectory. That disorders just don't appear. they are caused by the person's not developing in a non-disordered manner. Okay. So based on that, let's look at just a couple different types of disorders, okay, that we see, especially in middle childhood. The first few tend to be what we call neuropsychological, okay, and the first one that starts to develop definitely in middle childhood, but starts in early childhood, is dyslexia. Dyslexia is a problem with word recognition, decoding, and spelling. Okay, so a lot of individuals who have dyslexia tend to have hard time recognizing words in their regular spelling term, and also have trouble spelling out words. So and it's different for different people. In some individuals, it's they can't read sentences in the same way non-dyslexic individuals can. In other individuals, it's that they write, and they tend to write either the words backwards. So instead of spelling the word spelling spelling, they write it gnilleps. Okay. Now, in mild to moderate versions of dyslexia, it really interferes with the person's ability to keep up with learning with their peer group. So they tend, because they have a harder time decoding words and sounding them out and spelling them, they tend to start to lag behind their peer group because it takes them longer to work with and read at the proficiency level for their age group. We do know that dyslexia, and again, we don't have a causal link, but we know that these individuals tend to have a higher levels of things like glutamate and choline. And the interesting thing that also confuses many individuals that study dyslexia is it's not really connected with the Broca and Wernicke areas. And if you remember, the Broca and Wernicke areas is about understanding speech. Broca is about understanding speech. Wernicke's areas is about transmitting or expressing speech in words, okay? And with dyslexia, it seems to be more associated with an overproduction of different neurochemicals, just like with things like schizophrenia, which is an overproduction of dopamine, or in other disorders like depression, which seem to be an underproduction of things like serotonin, okay? Another common disorder is ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is where our brains tend to be hyperactive and have troubles with attention and impulse control. And some have suggested that it could be due to maternal alcohol or tobacco or drug use. But the truth is, and I think this is an important thing to make, with this disorder of ADHD, there is actually no known cause, okay? Because even we look at cross-cultural evidence for ADHD, we see problems with, for example, the number of individuals who have a disorder, okay? So, for example, here in the United States, the diagnosis rate is around 11%, but in a country like France, who has a very similar medical system and eats very similar foods to us, their diagnosis rate is under 1%. If we look at countries from Japan, until they started to westernize their education system, before the 1990s, they had 0 cases of ADHD. Okay, so on a cultural level, there's some issues when this and even on a toxin level, when we look at these possible causes, such as alcohol and tobacco use during pregnancy, there's so many other variables that play into alcohol and tobacco use that can also be associated with ADHD. Okay, so this is one of those disorders where we're still not sure what the causal aspect is. We do know that in modern times we tend to treat disorders both on a medical level and on a psychological behavioral level. And we've learned, for example, with ADHD, the best treatment is a combination of both for children who tend to be severe ADHD. And the interesting thing about what we do know about ADHD is it's, even though there's hyperactivity and impulse control, it's due to the slowing of neural processing in the brain. Hence, that's why we prescribe things such as stimulants to boost those dopamine levels, to boost those kind of adrenaline levels in the brain and get the brain working quicker, because it tends to be, the brain tends to go under repression, which I know sounds counter to what the behaviors and stuff of ADHD are. So really quickly, I think these two slides are kind of mixed up. What are some other risks and disorder risks in middle childhood? Okay. We know that these are things that are on the increase exponentially, meaning that each generation sees an exponential increase in these, and some include type 2 diabetes, asthma, emergency room trips, due to taking medications they shouldn't be taking, elevated blood pressure, cholesterol, and likelihood of cancer. And all of these tend to be associated with, I think everybody is aware of the obesity crisis here in the United States, and there's a lot of arguments about this, and I think that the areas of concern, for example, is our caloric diets have become more and more, for example, calorie laden with things like sodium and saturated fat, and inadequate high fiber foods such as whole fruits, greens, and yellow vegetables. We also see a deficiency in the amounts of vitamin A, C, and E. And a lot of individuals, professionals in this area contribute this to things such as our fast food diet, which in order to make those foods, you take out instead of put in different items into it. And then also more of our sedentary lifestyle, as denoted by this, there is an association. Well, I think these days we use the term screen time, not TV time. I think I need to update some of these slides. We use this, there is an association with child weight and screen time. Okay. And so, and we also see with media and stuff, there's less exposure to, there's more exposure to unhealthy ways of living. Okay. And so these are all arguments about how we can control the obesity crisis, more activity, and better foods. But as we all know, where is the majority of obesity crisis at? They're in what's called food deprived areas, places where individuals only have access to quick and processed foods. Okay. And that's why here on the Tohono Nation, there's been a big movement about bringing back traditional foods, helping individuals at our West Campus. There's programs to help people start gardens, those kinds of things. because one of the things that we know, even in Tucson into here, there's a limited amount of access to fresh, non-processed foods. When we talk about sleep during this period, this is where children need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep per night. And we know that lack of sleep tends to increase with age. And one of the concerns we're going to get during adolescence is during middle childhood, we need about 9 to 10. Current research is showing during adolescence, we needed around 10 to about 12. Okay, so need for sleep doesn't start to decrease until late early adulthood. But what we see during the adolescence and young adult years is individuals getting less and less sleep due to partying, staying up late, to playing games, those types of things. And we know that these are the things that tend to be associated with that lack of sleep, such as somatic complaints, meaning physical pains, poor school performance, mood disorders, motor skill problems, and behavioral problems. And again, these are associations, so there are correlations between amount of sleep and these different areas. Okay. Now, this is, I never liked it, but physical education classes, PE classes. It is interesting because what physical education came into play when the obesity crisis in the United States really started off. And we were also seeing some of the physical benefits of physical activity. Okay. So for part of this, the goal was to create interest in children to activities throughout their lifetime. Interestingly, only about 5 states in the United States actually require physical education. And children's attitudes towards PE become more negative over time. And so there's something going on with this program, as you would say, but it really started off because of the increase of obesity and child health concerns here in the United States. Okay. And there is what's called a leisure repertoire theory, which is lessons about leisure that last a lifetime. So leisure activities and preferences that are set in childhood tend to follow us into adulthood. So individuals during their leisure time that are interested in physical activity, sports, those types of things in childhood, that tends to follow individuals into adulthood. Whereas other people who see leisure time as relaxation, as what's the term I'm looking for? Less active. I'll just use, for lack of better words, less activity during leisure time. That also follows them into adulthood, and that's really why physical education programs started in the beginning. We do know that non-structured physical activity is very important. Okay. In fact, a study on recesses in school have shown, and this is a quote from the American Academy of Pediatrics, crucial and necessary component to child's development. Okay. And scarily, when we look at recess, now this is back in 2013, 2015, recess accounted for almost 40% of a child's daily physical activity. And it's an inexpensive way, and it promotes classroom attentive, social skill, and self-control. But what we have seen with the trends of recess is that the times are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. and then more class time is being implemented. And the studies that have looked at this have shown that as schools shrink the amount of recess kids get, it's associated with lower performance in the actual classroom. And that schools that actually increase recess time actually increase academic performance. Other interesting things is schools who have larger amount of recess time have lower rates of diagnosis of things like ADHD or hyperactivity, and have less behavioral problems in the classroom. So we're finding more and more that things like recess and physical activity are important skills to develop. So. During middle childhood, we also know that play continues to be an important part. Remember when we were talking about early childhood, we talked about the importance of role play and role models. And we're going to continue this throughout middle childhood, okay? And one kind of interesting form that tends to bother a lot of moms and some dads is rough and tumble play that children tend to naturally engage in. It's almost, even in a family that promotes peace and well-being, little children, young children will tend to engage in this rough and tumble play that looks like fighting, but the goal is to have fun, okay? And we found that this increases during early school years. And the interesting thing that we found is that it doesn't have any detrimental effects. In fact, it promotes physical and neural growth. We find that children who engage in more rough and tumble play tend to be physically more fit, stronger. And we also find that their cortical areas tend to be thicker and have more neural connections, okay? And the theory is that what rough and tumble play is really showing both children or all children involved is physical limitations, but also negotiation, because the goal isn't to create pain or harm. It's to see how far the children can take their physical bodies through being rough and tumbling, okay? There has also been a huge growth in the areas because of media and social media and our computer world, a big growth in the study between children who spend more time in their outdoors and their environment versus children who spend more time gaming indoors and those types of things. And we're finding that there's a benefit for outdoor experience, okay? And that's why, for example, when we look at Tucson, for example, they have the Children's Museum, and one of their newer center is an outdoor exploration center. And more child cares are investing in more outdoor type play, outdoor type growth. In fact, when we look at Prescott College, they actually, for early childhood educators, they have summer programs to teach teachers how to promote a child's outdoor environment inside the classroom, but also out in the real world. And we're just finding that again, when we look at this, we're seeing positive mental health outcomes. We're seeing cognitive outcomes. We're seeing, and again, physical health outcomes from increased access and increased outside time versus indoor inside time. And these are some of the things coming from all of this is we find that children tend to be less obese through play, greater ability to focus and attention, greater self-discipline, lower levels of distress. This higher self-worth is one that is kind of interesting to me because this is one of the biggest associations with nature. The more a child is in nature, the higher level of self-worth they have, which is kind of interesting. Okay. And we also know that children who play more, even if it's indoor or outdoor, tend to have positive and protective attitudes towards the natural world. Okay. All right. So we went over a lot of stuff today, so I'm going to turn off our